Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young Kim. President Joe Biden met with South Korean President Moon Jae-in for their first summit talks held in the White House. The two leaders sat down with each other to discuss regional security with the North Korea strategy topping agenda. Today we'll go through what was discussed during the first Biden-Moon summit. Joining me is Gary Seymore. He's professor of the practice of politics at Brandeis University. Dr. Samore served in the U.S. government for over 20 years, including the role of White House coordinator for arms control and weapons of mass destruction. Scott Snyder also joins me today. Mr. Snyder is director of the program on U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's authored numerous books on the Korean Peninsula, with the latest being South Korea at the Crossroads. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
First of all, Dr. Samore, what was most notable from the joint press conference of the two leaders?
Well, I think the two leaders announced several important agreements, but even more than that, they seemed to be very comfortable with each other. So I thought they had established a good personal rapport. The big news on North Korea, of course, was the announcement of the appointment of Ambassador Sung Kim to be the U.S. envoy for North Korea. The other two big announcements were, first of all, the very large investment by South Korean companies in various U.S. technologies, semiconductors and batteries and so forth. That was quite an important economic news. And then finally, there was news on the economic partnership, the vaccine partnership, including doses for 550,000 Korean servicemen. So I think those were the three big practical agreements that came out of the summit, beyond the fact that the leaders seemed to get along with each other and by and large agreed on all the main issues.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Mr. Snyder?
Well, I agree. It was very striking that there was so much emphasis on functional cooperation as related to supply chain resiliency, the South Korean investment in the United States in some critical sectors, and the vaccine partnership. And I also thought that the essentially almost a joint announcement of Ambassador Sung Kim as a special representative for North Korea was very striking.
Mm-hmm. As both of you mentioned, President Biden announced Korea diplomat Sung Kim will serve as the U.S. special envoy for North Korea. How did you take this announcement?
I don't recall ever seeing a personnel appointment made in that particular form, and I think that it really is intended to send the signal that both the U.S. and South Korea are supporting and hope that North Korea takes up an offer to engage directly with Ambassador Kim.
And that obviously is part of the effort by the U.S. and South Korea to encourage Kim Jong-un to accept the U.S. offer to resume nuclear negotiations. We'll see whether or not North Korea agrees.
The two leaders agreed to cooperate closely in resolving North Korea's nuclear issue. President Joe Biden said his team consulted closely with President Moon Jae-in's team throughout the process of the North Korea policy review. He said both the U.S. and South Korea also share a willingness to engage diplomatically with North Korea, as both countries move toward the ultimate goal of a complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Mr. Snyder, what did you make of the statement?
Well, I think there's a good argument that South Korea can make that, in fact, they have had influence on the process. Because if we look at, for instance, the U.S.-Japan statements in the Biden-Suga summit and some of the joint statements around that meeting and earlier, I think we do see a relative softening of the U.S. position and description of its engagement efforts with North Korea.
Mm-hmm. I agree with Scott. I think that from the South Korean standpoint, they're satisfied with the policy review. And in particular, President Moon spoke and explicitly said that the Singapore Summit declaration would be the basis for going forward with the negotiations. And President Biden, when he was asked about his willingness to meet with Kim Jong-un, he said he was willing to meet in principle, although the precise conditions that would have to be met were not exactly clear. But I think from South Korea's standpoint, they, as President Moon said, expects North Korea to make a positive response to the North Korean offer to resume negotiations. And I think we'll just have to wait and see whether Pyongyang is receptive or whether they continue to be silent or reject any U.S. offers to resume diplomacy.
Mm-hmm. President Moon said the two leaders discussed the commitments made between the two Koreas and between the U.S. and North Korea are essential for making a peaceful Korean peninsula. Dr. Seymore, why did the President Moon Jae-in mention this?
Well, I think from President Moon's standpoint, it was very important to mention inter-Korean agreements, and in particular, of course, the Panmunjom Agreement, which he is responsible for with Kim Jong-un, as being part of the diplomacy. President Biden did not mention inter-Korean agreements, which doesn't mean that he disagrees. It's just that I thought Biden's statement on North Korea was much less detailed than President Moon's statement. And I think from President Biden's standpoint, he spent more time talking about other issues on the agenda, like climate change and cooperation on emerging technologies and vaccine and so forth. For President Moon, North Korea clearly is the dominant issue, and he spent more time talking about that and some of the details.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, do you see the significance in President Moon Jae-in bringing up this past agreement?
Well, the main thing I think in his statement was his reference to the relationship between inter-Korean dialogue and U.S.-North Korea dialogue in the context of a virtuous cycle. And I think that what's going to be interesting is that he didn't necessarily indicate what the order should be in terms of any of that engagement. But in the past, in fact, the entire premise upon which the Moon administration's engagement with North Korea has occurred from March of 2018 was a premise that made the argument that prior efforts had failed because the U.S. DPRK and inter-Korean engagements had not been in sync with each other. And so I think that it's encouraging to some degree to hear President Moon come back and reaffirm that linkage.
Mm-hmm. And during the press conference, President Biden made it clear, unless there was a commitment that there will be discussion about North Korea's nuclear arsenal, he won't meet North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Dr. Seymore, this is consistent with what he had been saying, isn't it?
Well, in the past, Biden has been a little bit more explicit that there would have to be some kind of an agreement that the two leaders would announce. In other words, there would be a negotiated agreement on denuclearization. Perhaps could be just the initial steps or could be complete denuclearization, but some kind of an agreement. I thought in the press conference, Biden was not as specific, but I suspect that the U.S. position is actually would not support a summit meeting between Biden and Kim Jong-un unless there was some concrete agreement that had been negotiated beforehand.
Yeah, I agree. It appeared that the substantive conditions, first of all, it was somewhat ambiguous, but it seemed a little bit softer in terms of the way that the language that President Biden used. But then he talked about not wanting to give prestige or legitimacy to the North Korean leader. And I think that actually could be an aspect of the statement that the North Koreans may not be as happy to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Just to speculate, I wouldn't be surprised if in the private meeting, Moon Jae-in emphasized to President Biden how important it was that there be leader-to-leader contacts, which is not something President Biden, I think, has much enthusiasm about meeting directly with Kim Jong-un. So my guess is that in the press conference, President Biden knew that President Moon would like to keep open the possibility of direct meetings, direct summits. And so I think his statement was gracious in the sense that he leaned as forward as he could, consistent with his administration's position.
And during the press conference, the two leaders didn't mention about sanctions on North Korea, but Mr. Snyder, do you think it was discussed as Seoul kept calling for easing sanctions on North Korea?
Yeah, I'm sure it must have been discussed. It is interesting that it didn't come out in this particular press conference. But I think that there is an emerging pattern in the Biden administration in relations with South Korea, where on issues where there are sensitivities or potential disagreements, U.S. officials have been making unilateral statements rather than doing them at joint appearances. I would note that Secretary of State Blinken, in his first visit to Seoul, was quite explicit in Biden administration views on North Korean human rights in solo press appearances, but that in the context of U.S. ROK meetings, those kinds of statements have been absent.
Since you mentioned about human rights issue as well, do you think the issue of human rights situation in North Korea was also discussed between the two leaders?
I think it had to have come up in whatever form, but again, that's an issue I think that the Moon administration doesn't want to feature or highlight. And as host, I imagine that there is no particular reason for President Biden to surface it publicly.
Dr. Samore, how do you think the issues of human rights and sanctions were dealt between the two leaders during the summit?
Well, I agree with Scott that they were certainly discussed during the summit, if not in the private meeting, then certainly in the broader delegation meeting. But, you know, President Biden wanted to make President Moon as comfortable as possible. And so I think his statement was written, his public statement was written, so he avoided subjects would be uncomfortable for President Moon, like the importance of enforcing sanctions or pursuing human rights in North Korea. So I think this is just part of Biden's effort to be as positive as possible about U.S. willingness to engage North Korea and not say things which the North Koreans would find offensive or which might stand in the way of accepting U.S. offers. Right. But I'll say at the same time, twice Biden said the ultimate goal of complete denuclearization remained as the U.S. policy, and that's probably not something that Pyongyang wants to hear. So we'll have to wait and see how they respond. But if they respond negatively, I think it could very well be an objection to President Biden and Moon, for that matter, saying that complete denuclearization is the ultimate objective.
Then, Dr. Samore, what is the how, from now on, what do you think is the next move for the two countries as they decide to work together towards complete denuclearization of North Korea?
Well, the next move is not in Seoul or Washington. The next move is in Pyongyang. I mean, it's really time for Kim Jong-un to respond to the various overtures that have been made publicly and privately, offering to resume diplomacy on peace and denuclearization, inter-Korean relations. So, and of course, the U.S., I think, and South Korea have gone out of their way to indicate their willingness to engage in those discussions. I think we have to wait for North Korea to indicate some response, either positive or negative.
Mr. Snyder, do you agree with this view?
Yeah, I think that there are two dimensions to diplomacy as related to North Korea. One is diplomacy with North Korea, and that requires North Korea to participate. And then the fallback position is diplomacy about North Korea. And that's really about using international fora in order to highlight the ways in which North Korea is out of step with the expectations of the international community.
And President Moon Jae-in also announced that the U.S. and South Korea agreed on the termination of missile guidelines. What is the meaning of this for both countries?
Well, I found it curious because it came up so late in the South Korean media primarily. And frankly, in background briefings that I'm aware of on the U.S. side, that topic really didn't come up. And so either they don't regard it on the U.S. side as that serious, or it could have been a kind of surprise. Frankly, I think that issue is maybe more complicated from the perspective of Japan or China than it is with the U.S. And so that's actually what I'm curious about, is how the Japanese or Chinese governments might react to that announcement.
Dr. Samore, what is the implication of this announcement?
Well, there's very little substantive implication, because over the years, the U.S. has gradually relaxed the guidelines. And when they were originally established in 1979, they were very strict in terms of limiting the range and payload of South Korea's ballistic missile program. But then President Clinton relaxed it, President Obama relaxed it, President Trump relaxed it. So at this point, the limits are really very symbolic. But in any event, currently the limit was on an 800 kilometer range for South Korean ballistic missiles. I don't think there's any military requirement for South Korea to deploy any ballistic missile over 800 kilometers, because they can hit all the targets they need in North Korea with much less than that. But I agree with Scott. Let's see how the Chinese and the Japanese respond to this announcement. But I think it's probably more political symbolism than any practical implication in terms of South Korea's ballistic missile program.
My last question for today. Many news media were curious to find out how far President Biden and President Moon Jae-in will discuss about cooperation on China. And interestingly, President Biden said in the statement the two leaders agreed to cooperate in the issues of the regional security, including the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. Did you expect this statement to come out, Dr. Seymour first?
Well, I mean, to me, the most interesting thing is how little was said about China. I mean, Biden mentioned that two sides agreed on the importance of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits. President Moon, of course, did not mention that in his prepared statement. And only in response to a question from a reporter did he say, I thought somewhat gently, that the two sides agreed on the importance of the issue. So to me, I'm sure there was lots of discussion about China in the private setting, but in publicly, at least, I didn't think that there was much news to announce, that there were no new agreements on, for example, South Korean participation in the Quad or other things. Although I will say the supply chain agreement has a direct bearing on the U.S. competition with China. So the more that the U.S. and the ROK develop alternatives in semiconductors and advanced batteries, that is part of the competition with China. So even though China wasn't mentioned in that context, one of the big announcements of the summit, the $35 billion investment, does have implications for competition with China.
Mr. Snyder, what's your thought on what President Joe Biden said and President Moon Jae-in said about Taiwan Strait?
Well, with regard to Taiwan, I was surprised that it came up in the press conference. I thought it was very interesting that President Moon framed it in terms of trying to preserve peace. And I think that I agree with Gary, the supply chain resiliency issue is important as related to U.S.-South Korean engagement on Indo-Pacific issues. But I think what's really striking with regard to the Taiwan question is that if you use the U.S.-Japan joint statement as a template for what you might expect for the U.S. and South Korea, there's a dramatic difference between what can be said in the U.S.-Japan relationship about China and Taiwan and what can be said in the U.S.-South Korea relationship. And there, I think that basically South Korea is a good student that does well on the tests, but is deathly afraid of class participation.
As the first Biden-Moon summit took place, the U.S. seemed to have fully shared its result of the North Korea policy review, aiming to be in sync with South Korea on how to proceed its diplomacy towards North Korea. Now we'll have to see whether North Korea will make any reaction to this. Dr. Seymore, Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.